On a gray afternoon in October of 2006, a flatbed truck backed up to the fence line behind a hill farm outside West Rutland in Rutland County, Vermont, and tipped a load of broken marble onto the wet grass. No one came to the door, and no note got left behind. The driver threw the lever, let the bed climb, and the stone slid down in a slow white avalanche. Cracked blocks and streaked slabs and offcuts too odd to name, settling into the mud like something the world was done with. Della Voss was 32 that autumn, at her kitchen window with a mug of coffee cooling forgotten in her hands, watching the load grow. There was no anger in her face. She had the look of someone at the edge of a river, working out where to wade across. That morning set loose something the whole county would fail to see coming. Not the quarry, not the men who leaned on the counter down at the stone showroom. And not Vernon Speck, who owned that showroom, and who would spend years telling anyone who asked that whatever Della Voss was up to behind her fence was a hobby if you were kind, and a slow leak in the checkbook if you weren't. None of them saw it, and yet, looking back now, it is strange they could have missed it. Because the whole answer sat out there in the mud that morning, wrapped around a cup of cold coffee, already deciding where the first cut would go. Let me tell you who Della Voss was, because you cannot make sense of the stone until you make sense of the woman. She was born in 1974, the middle of 3 children, in a farmhouse her grandfather had raised with his own 2 hands on the steep western edge of the marble country. Her father, Voss, ran sheep and hay across 140 acres of hillside, the way his father had, and his father before him, up before 5. The same breakfast, the same fences, walked in the same order. He held, though he never put it into words, that the old methods had lasted because they were sound. Della loved that steadiness in him. She also, from about the time she could talk, could not leave a question alone. Why the splitting wedges opened the rock on one line and not the next. Emmett did not always have an answer, and it needled him. She was never a wild girl. She was a questioning one, and those are not the same animal. She was laying up wallstone before she could balance on a bicycle. Saturdays she spent in the shed with a cold chisel and a lump hammer, breaking down the culls her father dragged off the pasture. Nobody asked her to. She only wanted to learn how the rock chose to part. By 11 she could study a chunk of fieldstone and call the break before the hammer fell. Emmett caught her at it once, went quiet, then said, "You don't miss much." In the Voss house that counted as a whole paragraph. She earned a partial scholarship to the State University and studied geology and studio art together, a pairing her advisor called ambitious in a tone that meant something less flattering. A teacher there, a woman named Ada Reinhold, ran a course on stone and materials, and she opened the first class by telling the room that the most squandered resource in the whole valley was not the timber, nor the water, nor even the labor everyone fretted over. It was the ruined stone, the cracked block, the wildly veined slab, the piece with a fossil ghost drifting through it. The stone folks stepped past on their way to the flawless one. They toss out the interesting half, she said, and charge you extra for the dull half. Della copied that down and boxed it in ink. She carried it home to the hills when she graduated and kept it through the next 10 years, working her father's ground and helping him ride out the slow squeeze that came for every small farm she knew. Wool prices sliding, the cost of everything else climbing. Somewhere in those years she married Cal Merrick, a stonemason from a couple towns over who laid his tools out like a surgeon and knew, better than anyone she'd met, that what separated fine stonework from junk was never the price of the block, but the thinking behind the chisel. Cal was full of notions, about basins, about hearthstones, about what a working sink had to endure, the drop skillet, the pot of boiling water, the 20 years of a family leaning on its rim. He talked it through with Della over supper, the way a man talks to someone he trusts to do something with it. She took it in. She always took it in. Now here is where the marble came from, because that is the other half of this, and hardly anyone hears it. The marble quarry over at West Rutland had been sawing dimensional stone out of the mountain since 1958. Slabs for countertops, facing for banks and courthouses, tile for cold lobby floors. It was rough work, and no block came out of the ground clean. There was always waste around the edges, pieces shattered in the blasting, slabs veined too wildly to match a floor, blocks a hair too gray or too gold for a customer who wanted every inch identical. The culls were not worthless. They were only a nuisance, too flawed for the architects, too heavy to warehouse, too much bother to sort. For years, the quarry paid to truck that waste up to a spoil heap on the back shoulder of the mountain. In 2006, the yard boss, Roy Tibbett, decided the hauling was money down a hole, and that landowners with acreage and no fuss about free rock might carry it off at no charge. Nothing paid, nothing signed. A phone call and a flatbed, and that was the whole arrangement. A handful of farmers said yes. Emmett said yes too, on the logic that freestone was freestone, and he could shore up a wall with it. He brought it up over breakfast one morning, casual, the way you remark on the weather. Della set down her fork and asked how heavy the loads ran and how often they came. He told her. She went back to her eggs and did not speak again until the plates were cleared. But she was already somewhere else behind her eyes. The first load landed in October. She let the coffee go cold at the window. Then she set the mug down, pulled on her boots, walked out to the heap, and crouched and lifted a cracked block nobody in the county would have glanced at twice. What she made of it over the next 11 days is where this story truly opens. Marble is not the mysterious stone people take it for. It starts as limestone, the packed shells and mud of some ancient seabed, until heat and pressure far underground recrystallize the calcite into a dense, tightly locked mass. That is all metamorphism means, changed form. Those colored veins buyers pay a fortune for are only impurities trapped in the original mud. Clay, iron, stray minerals, dragged into ribbons by the very pressure that hardened the rock. In marble, the flaw and the beauty are one and the same. Let me tell you about that first basin, because everything that came afterward grew straight out of it. For 3 weeks after the October load, Della did little but sort. Her evenings went to the heap with a headlamp and a stick of blue keel, flipping pieces over, wrapping them, listening. A sound block rings under the hammer. A cracked one answers with a dull thud. She marked each piece by what her ear and eye told her. The density, the vein, where a fracture would hold. She'd spent half a year already reading and watching, sending off for books and studying every pair of hands she could find shape a bowl from solid rock. Then she settled on one piece, a thick, creamy block maybe 16 inches across, a gray vein drifting through it like wood smoke and a hairline cracked near a corner she could work around. She carried it in, set it on the kitchen table, studied it a while, then fetched her father's old carving chisels and a sack of silicon carbide grit. The work took 11 days, evenings once the chores were done, and mornings before the day got going. With no pattern, she drafted her own on butcher paper from the sink in Cal's shop, and 2 more she'd bought secondhand. She hogged out the hollow with a chisel and a small grinder, then worked down through rougher and finer grit until the bowl was slick as a creek stone. The hairline crack she left in plain sight. She routed a shallow channel across it and seeded a slim butterfly of darker stone into the gap, keying the 2 halves together so the flaw became a small dark bow tie riding the lip. Finished. The basin weighed just shy of 40 pounds. It was not flawless. One side of the rim rode a whisker low, but set your hands on it and they understood, ahead of your head, that it would never give out in your lifetime or your children's. She handed it to Cal. He set it on his shop bench and said nothing for a week. Then one evening he put down his coffee and said, "Your drain slope's a 1/4 inch short, so it'll pool. Correct that. Past that, it's the finest sink I've ever laid hands on." Della noted both things in her cutting log. The canvas-bound book where she kept her measurements. She fixed the slope on the very next one. Now here is where the whole business first spilled into public view. One April morning in 2007, at the stone showroom on the edge of town. Speck Stone and Tile was a long building with a concrete floor and a counter buffed smooth by 30 years of leaning elbows. It belonged to Vernon Speck, who'd been selling countertops and tile across Rutland County since the 1980s, and who was not a cruel man but a sure one. And sureness can be harder to argue with than cruelty. He carried a settled notion of what would sell, and nowhere in it was a woman shaping sinks from the quarry's cast-offs. Della came in with 2 basins bundled in moving blankets in the truck bed. She carried one inside and set it on the counter. Vernon turned it over, ran a thumb down the polished hollow, pressed the little dark butterfly at the lip, and read the price she'd chalked on the tag. $180. The quiet lasted maybe 2 seconds. Then he began to laugh. Not a mean laugh exactly. The laugh of a man who'd watched plenty of ventures fizzle and had grown a nose for the next one. "Della," he said, in the patient voice you'd use on a child, "the people who walk in here buy the $60 resin bowl at the home store, and they're content. And when it splits in 8 years, they buy another. Not one of them is laying out 180 for a rock. He nudged the basin back toward her. It's a fine hobby. I mean, no offense. Della folded the basin back into its blanket. And what do they lay out replacing that bowl 3 times over 30 years? She asked. He blinked. Mine outlasts the kitchen it sits in, she said. I can show you the tests. Vernon gave her the smile of a man who'd already settled the matter in his own head. I hope it works out for you, he said. She drove the county road home with the windows down and wrote 3 lines in her log. First, get formal durability data. Second, try 180 as a premium price. Third, word for word, Speck turned me away. Come back in 2 years. Now here's the science the ones who laughed never troubled to learn. The cheap basins Vernon meant were resin composite, or thin-honed marble tile glued to a backing, resin-ape stone, and acts nothing like it. It scorches under a hot pan, dulls, yellows in the sun, and splits along its molded seams inside a decade. Thin tile crazes into a spiderweb of cracks the first time boiling water hits the cold surface. The rejects out of the West Rutland quarry had the opposite trouble. Tossed for their looks, a vein too loud, a color off the swatch, never for weakness. The crystal was tight, the stone was dense, and the very veins that got them rejected were exactly what a buyer with an eye would pay more for. What they lacked was sameness. What they had was everything else. So Della ran her own trials, the way Ada Reinhold had drilled into her. She sawed 12 small panels, 6 from her quarry culls, 6 from resin bowls the home store carried, weighed each dry, soaked them a day, and weighed them again to see how much each drank. She poured boiling water across them over and over, and left beads of vinegar, coffee, and wine sitting on each overnight. Every week she photographed all 12 and dated the picture. Inside 2 months, the resin panels had scorched and dulled, and one had cracked clean through. Her marble panels drank next to nothing, ignored the heat, and wiped clean. She slid the photographs into a folder in the kitchen drawer, next to her log, and she had the arithmetic. The stone cost nothing. Her only outlay was grit, blades, a little sealer, and the small butterflies of contrast stone. A few dollars a basin. Her labor, which she wasn't yet paying herself a dime for, ran about 6 hours apiece. At $180, her margin on materials alone cleared 80%. Money was never the choke point. The choke points were hours in the day and doors to sell through. She turned the page in her log, and beneath the line about Vernon Speck's laugh, wrote how many basins she meant to make the coming year. Here is the thing about marble. The resin sellers count on you not knowing. Marble is mostly calcite, and calcite is fragile in one exact way. It reacts to acids. A splash of lemon, wine, or vinegar left on a polished surface will etch a dull mark, dissolving a whisker of the stone, not a stain, but a small burn. That is why marble gets sealed, and why a honed finish hides wear better than a polished one. Density and sealer never halt the chemistry. They only slow how fast the world eats at the stone. Let me tell you about the stretch between 2007 and 2011, because those are the years people skip when they tell this story, and the years that made everything else possible. Della didn't walk away from the farm, didn't borrow against anything, didn't bring on a single hand. She worked the hill beside her father by day and carved evenings and weekends, and she moved her basins through every channel that didn't have to pass across Vernon Speck's counter. She sold at craft fairs and farm auctions. She rented a folding table at the county fair for $40, hauled down 2 basins and a stack of hearth tiles, and came home 2 days later with $600 and a page of names and numbers from people wanting more. She sold to a kitchen showroom over the next ridge that set 1 basin in its window on consignment, and within a month, the owner rang asking for 4. She sold to a builder down in the flatland, sick of handing every client the same resin bowl their neighbors had, who bought 3 at once and phoned back to say his customers kept asking who'd made them. A small notice in a regional country living paper drew 41 orders out of 3 states in a single year, and she kept getting better. The rim that had ridden a hair crooked on the first basin was dead level by the 50th. More than that, she built a system for the stone coming in. Every load the quarry dropped, she sorted by grade. The heaviest, densest, soundest blocks, the ones that rang clearest, went to basins and hearthstones. The pieces that had to bear weight and heat for a lifetime. The middle grade turned into garden troughs and windowsills and carved house signs. The lighter, softer pieces became coasters and small bowls. And the least scraps, Too little for anything structural. She ground and polished into bookends and stone mortars and pocket paperweights, priced at $12 each and costing her, in stone, nothing at all. Nothing left the heap as waste a second time. In 2008, she sold a bit over 90 basins and maybe 400 small pieces. By 2010, it was 230 basins and better than 1,000 of the little things. A gross just under $38,000 against a cost of only blades, grit, and sealer. The stone stayed free. Cal had shed most of his own masonry jobs by then and spent his days helping her. He built her a proper carving bench, a wall rack for the sorted grades, and a foot-driven lap wheel that brought up a polish faster and truer than she could by hand. And quietly, never making anything of it, he'd begun telling every builder and plumber he knew that his wife made a sink that would outlast the buyer, and they ought to call her. That word of mouth accounted for close to a third of her orders. She knew the figure because she asked every new customer how they'd found her and jotted the answer in her log. Emmett watched all of it from a wary remove. He never blocked her path. He'd turned over the shed corner unasked, and not once had he called the stonework a drain on the farm. But he was a hill farmer, and hill farmers held a certain view of branching out, that it was what people reached for once they'd lost faith in the work in front of them. So he watched. He watched the heap shrink and the truck come back to fill it. He watched the order book on the kitchen counter, and Della noticed he'd taken to reading it the way he read the wool and hay quotes, slowly, giving nothing away. One evening in the spring of 2011, he came to the table after supper and said, "What kind of room would you need?" She looked up. "If I cleared you more room, would you turn out more of them?" She said she would. "The old milking parlor sits empty. Take it." Then he lifted his coffee and went back to the front room. That was all of it. Emmett's way of telling her he'd been paying attention, and he'd made up his mind. Now here is where Vernon Speck said the thing he'd spend years trying to unsay. The county held its heritage trades gathering that fall at the Grange Hall, where the agenda always outran the clock, and the honest talk waited for the gravel lot outside. Della had been going 2 years, taking a seat toward the back and doing more listening than talking, because the Grange Hall was where the county quietly sorted the serious from the foolish, and she wanted to see how that sorting worked. Vernon sat on the committee meant to nudge farmers toward income beyond their main crop. He stood that night and gave a short talk on small side ventures. A fellow 2 towns over who bottled maple syrup. A family that opened their orchard for hay rides. He made no mention of Della Voss, seated 8 rows behind him with her log in her lap, who'd by then pulled better than $60,000 out of stone the county's own quarry had been paying to bury. Afterward, out in the lot, someone asked Vernon what he thought of the Voss basin business. He answered with the calm of a man whose calls had mostly come good across a long life. "It's a cute little sideline," he said. "Sooner or later, she runs out of folks fool enough to pay boutique money for a chunk of rock, and then she's back to the sheep. No harm done." He paused. "Handwork only reaches so many buyers. That well's got a bottom, always did." 3 men heard it. One repeated it to Della the next week. She said it in her log exactly as he'd said it, the way she recorded everything, then turned the page and wrote out her targets for the year ahead. By the winter of 2011, Cal had insulated the old parlor, wired it for light, and hung a wall of plywood patterns for every piece she made. In February, she took on her first help, June Alcott, 23, raised near the quarry, with stonework from a Votech shop behind her that she'd never figured might become a trade. For 3 weeks, Della walked her through all of it. How to grade the loads, rough a blank, bring up a polish, and the bar every basin had to clear before it left the shed. June learned quick. By spring, her bowls came off the bench so clean that Della couldn't pick them out from her own. Here is something worth knowing about a quarry. When a dimensional stone operation cuts blocks for building and countertop work, only a fraction of what it pulls from the ground ever ships as a saleable slab, often less than a third. The rest is waste, overburden, blocks shattered in the blasting, pieces with veins or colors that miss a client's spec, and the sawdust fine grit thrown off by the cutting wire. Most of it goes to a spoil pile and is never touched again. What one buyer writes off as a defect, the earth spent 100 million years making. Let me tell you about the winter of 2012, because it is the part the people who know the name Voss Stoneworks always come back to, and the part that answered the question Vernon Speck never thought to ask. That winter was the hardest Rutland County had seen in 20 years, An ice storm in December brought down fences and killed lambs, and the wool price that spring came in so low it hardly covered the shearing. Emmett Voss's flock, which had carried the family since before Della was born, lost money for the first time in his life. All across the county, farm households worked sums with no good answer. Della's stone shop turned its best quarter that same winter. People don't quit building kitchens because it snows. The quarry didn't quit cutting, so the heap kept filling and the orders kept arriving. Whatever was squeezing the margins on every sheep farm around had no purchase on what Della did. It wasn't lashed to weather or wool prices, but to something else. She'd looked at a mound of waste and seen worth, and built a living no storm could reach. Emmett sat at the kitchen table one February evening with the farm's ledger open, and beside it, the monthly stone report Della had taken to leaving on the counter. He studied one, then the other. Then he said, "Lo, you had the right of it." Della was at the sink. She only nodded. He asked what she needed. She told him. 2 more pairs of hands, a second lap wheel, a room for packing orders. He said, "Then do it," and went out to the porch to look over the white fields. Now here is where the ceiling Vernon Speck kept naming finally caved in. It was a Wednesday in the fall of 2013. He came unannounced in his pickup. June was at the polishing wheel, 2 newer hands at the benches, the air thick with whetstone and linseed oil. Vernon took in the room a moment, then pulled off his cap. "Word is you're doing near $250,000, he said. Della said, "Not quite. Around 180,000 this year. We'll clear $250,000 the next." I said that well had a bottom, he told her. Della held his eye. "You said handwork only reaches so many buyers. That well's got a bottom. Always did." She had it back at him word for word. "I never set out to sell crafts," she said. "I set up a small factory that happens to use hand skills, making a thing the market had starved for. That's not the same animal." After a while, he said, "I'd like to carry your work." She said, "I figured you would," and passed him a wholesale sheet. He read it. "Higher than I'd have guessed." She said, "Minimum order's 30, net 30, and I'll want it signed." He took the folder. "All right," he said. He drove off down the county road, and Della went in and told June. And June laughed, and Della laughed too. The first time Vernon Speck had made her laugh instead of bristle since that April at his counter. After that, it went fast. In the spring of 2015, a writer from a regional magazine spent a day at the shed and ran a piece on the woman carving sinks out of the quarry's throwaway stone. A national trade paper picked it up, and that landed in front of a buyer for a home and hardware chain down in the flatland, hunting American-made goods for a premium shelf. His chain ran 30-some stores across 3 states. He wanted 3 designs, 400 pieces a quarter. Della worked the arithmetic in her log and told him she could handle it. He asked how she'd keep the quality steady at that volume. She said, "Because the method was finished long before the volume ever showed up. I had the standard locked down before I needed the output." He called 3 of her accounts, then called back the next week. That order carried Voss Stoneworks past $500,000 in a single year. Emmett didn't see all of where it went. He died in the winter of 2018, at 79, of a heart that quit without warning in the house where he'd been born. He'd watched the business rise from a mound of culls on his gravel to a shop with a dozen hands, and never let slip a word you could mistake for surprise. He'd told her you had the right of it one February and never had cause to say it again, because every monthly report said it for him. That same year, the quarry's old boss retired, and Della set the freestone arrangement down in a proper written agreement, a fixed schedule. First refusal on every sound call. She was still the only soul who'd ever thought to ask for it on paper. Let me tell you one last thing, because this story doesn't close on a contract or on the day Vernon Speck bared his head. In the spring of 2023, Della's daughter Iris, 19, home from her first year at the State University, studying stone the way her mother once had, settled at the same kitchen table where Della had once sat with a cracked block and a chisel. Iris laid out pages of notes. "I want to talk to you about the dust," she said. "The quarry throws off the fine grit from the saws, tons of it, and nobody has a use for it. But you can cast it into terrazzo. That market's 3 times the size of the one we're in, and nobody around here makes it from reclaimed stone. If we lock up first claim on the dust, we open a whole second line, and the buyers overlap with the ones we already have." She had the figures, a professor who'd steered her to a shop overseas that had done exactly this, and a notebook of her own. Della looked at the folder a long time. She thought back to that October truck and the stone easing into the mud, to Vernon Speck's laugh over the counter, to Ada Reinholdt swearing the most wasted thing in the whole valley was the ruined stone everyone stepped past. She turned it over for 10 seconds. Then she said, "Walk me through the numbers." Outside, the county road ran off flat and straight toward the ridgeline as it always had, and the quarry's trucks still rolled in on their schedule. And behind the fence, the heap still filled and emptied. And by the gate, catching the spring rain in its hollow, rested the first basin she ever carved. Crooked Rim, the small dark butterfly bridging the crack she'd refused to hide. Cal had stood it there years back and never moved it. Della looked at it and said, to Iris and to no one, "They kept telling me the flaw was the problem. The flaw was the whole point. You just have to be the one willing to bend down and pick it up." Terrazzo is one of the oldest ways of using stone that would otherwise be thrown out. Chips and dust from cutting marble and granite get bound into cement or resin, poured as a surface, then ground and polished flat, so the scattered stone shows through. Some terrazzo floors have lasted centuries. It began as plain thrift. Venetian workers pressing marble scraps from bigger jobs into the terraces around their homes, turning a day's leavings into a floor meant to last for generations.